Behind him, sirens began to wail in the distance, but they weren't heading his way. They were racing toward the locations mentioned in the false leads he'd carefully planted during his interrogation. By the time they realized their mistake, he'd be crossing state lines, transforming from a wanted suspect into just another traveler on a rainy night. The perfect escape, he reflected, isn't about speed or strength or even cleverness. It's about understanding human nature, about knowing that people see what they expect to see, believe what fits their preconceptions, and rarely look deeper than the surface of things. In a world of noise and chaos, true invisibility comes from being unremarkably normal. And now, walking calmly through the rain, he was achieving exactly that, becoming a ghost in plain sight, a story without an ending, a mystery that would never quite be solved. The evening air felt cool against his face as he stepped through the station's front doors. Streetlights cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the sound of city traffic created a perfect blanket of background noise. He maintained the same confident walk he'd used inside, not too fast, not too slow. Just another person heading home after a long day. Behind him, the police station continued its normal evening routine. Through the glass doors, he could see the front desk officer chatting with a newly arrived colleague. The modified visitor's badge on his chest caught the light as he gave them a casual nod. They nodded back, already focusing on their conversation about weekend plans. His heart was beating steadily, neither racing nor slow. Years of meditation practice had taught him to control his body's responses, to maintain composure even in the most intense situations. Right now, that composure was his best disguise. People notice nervousness. They remember someone who seems anxious or in a hurry. But they rarely remember someone who appears completely at ease. A police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the area. The suspect didn't flinch or try to hide. That would attract attention. Instead, he checked his watch as if mildly annoyed by the bright lights, just like any ordinary citizen would do. The cruiser passed by, its officers focused on starting their night shift. He crossed the street, timing his pace with the traffic lights. Each step took him further from the station, but he knew better than to rush. Distance wasn't his primary concern right now, invisibility was. He'd learned long ago that the first few minutes after an escape were the most crucial. This was when most people made mistakes, let their guard down, celebrated too early. The city bus pulled up to its stop right on schedule. He'd memorized the routes months ago, knowing they would play a crucial role in his plan. As he climbed aboard, he gave the driver a tired smile, the same expression worn by dozens of other passengers heading home after a long day at work. Finding a seat near the middle of the bus, he settled in like any other commuter. Not too far back where troublemakers usually sat, not too close to the front where his face would be easily visible to the driver. Just another face in the crowd, forgotten as soon as seen. Through the window, he watched the police station disappear from view. By now, the young guard in the medical bay would be discovered. The detective would be called back from her paperwork. Alarms would be raised, descriptions would be circulated. But those descriptions would be of a man in handcuffs, possibly in medical distress, not of the calm, well-dressed individual currently riding the westbound bus. Other passengers got on and off at various stops, each wrapped up in their own world. An elderly woman struggled with her shopping bags. He helped her stir them in the overhead rack, earning a grateful smile. Every normal interaction added another layer to his camouflage of ordinariness. His fingers brushed against the bus ticket in his pocket, purchased weeks ago and carefully aged to look well used. The smallest details matter most, he'd always believed. A new ticket might have drawn attention, might have stuck in someone's memory. But a one ticket, that was forgettable, normal, safe. As the bus crossed the river, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the city lights reflecting off the water. Beauty could be found anywhere, even in moments of intense focus. The detective would probably appreciate that thought, he mused. She'd been a worthy opponent, sharp and observant. In another life, they might have had fascinating conversations about human nature and the art of observation. The bus turned west, heading toward the state line. In his pocket, a second ID waited, one that would match the ticket he'd already purchased for the overnight train. Each step of his journey had been planned months in advance, each transition designed to be smooth and unremarkable. A light rain began to fall, drops trickling down the bus window. perfect weather for his purposes, people pay even less attention to faces when they're hurrying to get out of the rain. Nature itself seemed to be contributing to his disappearing act. He thought about the detective returning to the empty medical bay, piecing together how he'd managed his escape. She'd figure it out eventually. She was good at her job. But by then, he'd be long gone, leaving behind nothing but questions and a story that would be told in police break rooms for years to come. The bus approached his stop, and he pulled the cord with unhurried movements. As he stepped onto the wet sidewalk, he opened an umbrella, cheap, black, identical to thousands of others in the city. Just another commuter trying to stay dry, vanishing into the rainy evening like a drop of water returning to the ocean. When the camera resumed its rotation, the scene it captured looked perfectly normal. But by then, the suspect was already in the hallway, moving with purpose but not hurry. He'd learned long ago that running attracted attention. Calm, confident movement was the key to becoming invisible in plain sight. The name badge he'd modified during his earlier performance was now displayed prominently on his chest. In the confusion of shift change, with new faces everywhere, no one looked twice at another person in civilian clothes with proper identification displayed. As he walked past the nurse's station, he nodded politely to the staff member updating patient charts. She nodded back absently, focused on her work. Perfect. In emergency situations, people expect chaos and confusion. But in routine moments like this, they expect normalcy, and that expectation becomes a kind of invisibility cloak for those who know how to use it. The shift change couldn't have come at a better time. Through the small window in the medical bay door, he watched the day staff gathering their belongings, exchanging casual conversations with the incoming night shift. The familiar dance of workers eager to head home created the perfect cover for what would come next. His condition had stabilized enough that they'd left him with just one young officer standing guard. The detective had reluctantly returned to her office to update her superiors and handle the paperwork this medical emergency had created. Everything was falling into place, just as he planned. The guard checked his phone quickly, against protocol, but a natural human habit during a dull assignment. In that brief moment of distraction, the suspect's fingers moved with practiced precision. The handcuffs, already compromised by his earlier work with the paperclip, silently released their grip. He kept his hands positioned to appear still restrained, maintaining the illusion for just a bit longer. The medical bay was quieter than the interrogation room had been. The soft hum of equipment and distant voices from the hallway created a peaceful atmosphere that made people lower their guard. Even the guard's posture had relaxed slightly, his shoulders dropping as the minutes ticked by without incident. He'd memorized the staff schedules during his hours of observation. The night nurse would do her first rounds in exactly 7 minutes. The security cameras in this section of the building cycled every 3 minutes, with a 2-second gap between rotations, another detail he'd noted during his arrival. Timing would be everything. A group of officers walked past the door, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they discussed dinner plans. The guard's stomach growled audibly. It was past the usual dinner hour, and the human body was predictable in its needs. Another small detail working in his favor. The suspect shifted slightly on the medical bed, letting out a soft groan that drew the guard's attention. When the young officer glanced his way, he appeared to be sleeping fitfully. The guard relaxed again, probably thinking about the end of his shift and his own delayed meal. 5 minutes until the nurse's rounds. The camera in the corner of the room had just completed its sweep. In the hallway, the sounds of the shift change were dying down as the day staff filtered out of the building. The moment was approaching. He began regulating his breathing again, but differently now. Instead of the panicked gasps from earlier, he shifted to slow, deep breaths that suggested someone falling into a deeper sleep. The guard noticed. He could tell by the slight shuffle of feet as the officer settled in for what he expected to be a quiet watch. 4 minutes. 3. The suspect's mind counted down while his body remained still. He'd learned years ago that success in situations like this wasn't about speed or strength, it was about patience. About waiting for that perfect moment when everything aligned. A cart rolled past in the hallway, probably the cleaning staff beginning their evening rounds. The sound of wheels on linoleum briefly masked all other noises. The guard stifled a yawn. The camera completed another rotation. 2 minutes now. The suspect's fingers flexed slightly, preparing for movement while appearing completely at rest. Every muscle was ready, but not tense. Tension would be visible, and visibility was the enemy of success. The guard's phone buzzed. A text message, by the sound of it. Just as the suspect had observed earlier, the young officer couldn't resist the urge to check it. Human nature was wonderfully predictable sometimes. 1 minute. The distant elevator dinged, signaling the arrival of the night nurse for her rounds. Right on schedule. The guard straightened slightly, preparing for her arrival. The camera began its final rotation before the 2-second gap would occur. Everything happened in a sequence so perfectly timed it almost seemed choreographed. As the camera hit its blind spot, the suspect rolled smoothly off the bed, his movements fluid and silent. The guard, startled by the sudden action, reached for his radio, but the suspect was already moving. Years of studying pressure points and human anatomy made his actions precise and efficient. A quick press to the guard's shoulder, not enough to cause real damage, but perfect for temporarily disrupting motor control. The young officer's grip on the radio faltered. The suspect caught the radio before it could clatter to the floor, simultaneously guiding the guard into the chair he just vacated. To anyone glancing through the window, it would look like the officer was simply sitting, watching over his sleeping prisoner. The wheelchair arrived, creating a new flurry of activity as they discussed the safest way to move him. More decisions, more uncertainty, more chances for small details to go unnoticed. As they prepared for the transfer, he knew the next few moments would determine everything. The pieces were in place. Now it was just a matter of choosing the perfect moment to make his move. The medical response team's arrival had transformed the quiet interrogation room into a scene of controlled chaos. 4 people moved around the small space, their shadows dancing on the walls under the harsh fluorescent lights. The suspect remained slumped against the cold floor, his chest rising and falling in irregular patterns, but his mind was sharp as ever. Through half-closed eyes, he watched the detective gather her files from the table, papers shuffling as she quickly cleared space for the medical equipment. In her haste, she knocked over her empty coffee cup. It rolled across the table, coming to rest near the edge. Another small distraction adding to the confusion. The medic was taking charge now, her voice calm but commanding as she directed the officers to help position the suspect more comfortably. "We need to get these cuffs adjusted," she said, gesturing to how his awkward position was restricting his breathing. The detective hesitated for just a moment, procedure warring with medical necessity. That moment of uncertainty was all he needed. As they worked to adjust his restraints, his fingers moved with practiced precision. The paperclip he palmed earlier was now proving its worth. Years of practicing with similar locks in his tiny apartment, hours spent studying mechanism designs in technical manuals, it all came down to muscle memory now. Each tiny movement hidden by the larger motions of the people around him. The medic's equipment bag lay open on the floor, its contents partly spilled from the rushed entrance. Rolls of gauze, a stethoscope, various medical supplies, and most importantly, a distraction. Every time someone reached for something in the bag, eyes naturally followed the movement. Basic human psychology, working in his favor. Blood pressures still elevated, the medic announced, removing the cuff. Pulse is irregular. She reached for her penlight, preparing to check his pupil response. The bright beam would give him the perfect excuse to flinch away, another small movement to disguise his real actions. The detective had stepped back to speak quietly into her radio, updating her superiors on the situation. Her voice was professional but tense, explaining how their prime suspect in a major case was now experiencing a medical emergency. Behind the two-way mirror, he could sense movement, the observers likely discussing how this would affect their investigation. One of the officers was asking about calling an ambulance, creating a new thread of discussion about jurisdiction and prisoner transport protocols. Every new question, every moment of uncertainty, added another layer to the confusion he'd orchestrated. In emergency situations, people focus on the obvious threat, a medical crisis, while smaller details slip past unnoticed. The suspect let out a particularly harsh gasp, causing everyone to focus on his face. In that split second, his fingers completed their work with the paperclip. He felt the tiny mechanism in the handcuffs shift, not enough to free himself yet, but everything was now in position. Timing would be crucial for the next phase. "We need to move him to the medical bay," the medic decided, reaching for her radio to call for a wheelchair. More procedures, more protocols to follow. Each new person involved meant another variable, another potential distraction. The beauty of bureaucracy was how it created its own complexity. The detective's phone buzzed again. The crime scene team, maybe, or her superiors demanding updates. She glanced at it reflexively, then back to the unfolding scene before her. That split-second divided attention was exactly what he'd been counting on throughout his performance. Papers from the case file had scattered across the floor in the commotion. The young officer, trying to be helpful, began gathering them up. As he bent down, his utility belt shifted, keys jingling softly. The suspect's ears picked up the sound immediately, standard issue keys, all potential tools if needed, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. The medic was preparing an oxygen mask now, the hiss of gas adding another layer of sound to the room's chaos. Perfect cover for any small noises he might need to make in the next few minutes. Every new element that entered the scene became another piece in his elaborate puzzle. His performance had to stay consistent, the shallow breathing, the occasional tremor, the unfocused gaze. But beneath that facade, his mind kept perfect track of every person's position, every potential tool within reach, every exit route. Years of planning had taught him to track multiple details simultaneously, to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. The beauty of his plan lay in its simplicity. In an emergency, people fall back on their training, follow procedures, act predictably. He hadn't needed to create an elaborate distraction, just a simple medical crisis that would make everyone involved follow their standard protocols. And in following those protocols, they would inevitably create the opportunity he needed. As they prepared to move him, he kept his breathing shallow and irregular, maintaining the appearance of distress, while his mind remained perfectly clear and focused. The next few minutes would determine everything. But for now, he waited, played his part, and let the situation develop exactly as he planned. 3 hours into the interrogation, the atmosphere in the small room had grown heavy with tension. The suspect's breathing had become noticeably irregular over the past 20 minutes, supple at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing moment. The detective, who had returned with a third cup of coffee and a fresh stack of photos, was trying hard not to notice, but her training made it impossible to ignore. He pulled at his collar, letting his hands shake slightly. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead, not from nervousness, but from careful control of his breathing pattern. He'd practiced this technique countless times, learning how to control his body's responses just as precisely as he controlled his words. "Are you feeling all right?" the detective asked, her professional demeanor cracking slightly as she watched him struggle to catch his breath. The concern in her voice was genuine, exactly what he'd been counting on. Even the most hardened law enforcement officers were still human, still bound by their duty of care. I don't." He let his voice trail off, his right hand clutching at his chest. The movement caused the handcuffs to rattle against the metal table, a sound that drew everyone's attention. Behind the two-way mirror, he could sense movement. The observers were getting concerned. This wasn't part of their usual script. The detective leaned forward, her case file forgotten on the table. "Do you need medical attention?" Her hand moved toward her radio, another predictable response. He'd studied emergency protocols extensively. In situations involving possible medical distress, officers were required to prioritize the suspect's well-being over the investigation. His response was to gasp more deeply, letting his eyes go wide with apparent panic. Years of watching street performers and studying method actors had taught him how to make every gesture appear genuine. The slight bluish tinge to his lips, achieved by holding his breath in specific patterns, was a particularly effective touch. "Can't breathe," he managed to whisper, then slumped forward as far as his restraints would allow. The chair scraped against the floor with a harsh metallic sound that echoed in the small room. In the fluorescent light, his skin had taken on an alarming pallor. The detective was on her feet instantly, radio in hand. "I need medical assistance in interview room 3, she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. Suspect showing signs of respiratory distress. The response was immediate. He could hear running footsteps in the hallway, even as she moved around the table toward him. This was the crucial moment, the point where chaos would work in his favor. As the detective reached for his shoulder to keep him from falling, he let his body go completely limp, sliding sideways off the chair. The movement was carefully calculated. He knew exactly how far the handcuffs would allow him to fall. The door burst open as 2 officers and a medical responder rushed in. The small room suddenly felt even smaller, filled with urgent voices and quick movements. "Give him some space," the medic called out, pushing through with an emergency kit. The detective stepped back, her face etched with concern and professional frustration. In the confusion, nobody noticed how his fingers moved beneath the table or how his eyes, though seemingly unfocused, tracked every movement in the room with precise attention. The paperclip he palmed earlier was now exactly where he needed it, thanks to the seemingly random movements of his panic attack. The medic knelt beside him, checking his pulse and breathing. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, pulling out a blood pressure cuff. The detective answered, but he barely heard her response. He was counting seconds, tracking movements, waiting for the perfect moment. "His blood pressure's elevated," the medic announced, her voice carrying that professional urgency that always made people move a little faster, think a little less clearly. "We need to get him to the medical bay." More movement, more confusion, exactly as he planned. They were discussing whether to call an ambulance or use the station's medical facility. The detective was explaining about the ongoing investigation, the need for security. Every person in the room was focused on the medical emergency unfolding before them, which meant nobody was focusing on the small movements of his hands or the way he'd positioned himself during the fall. Through barely open eyes, he watched the controlled chaos unfold around him. Years of planning, months of preparation, all coming down to these crucial moments. As they debated the best course of action, he remained limp and unresponsive, conserving his energy for what would come next. He closed his eyes, appearing to rest, but his mind was racing, reviewing every detail of his plan. The real performance was about to begin, and timing would be everything. In the game of cat and mouse, sometimes the mouse needs to convince the cat they're winning, right up until the moment they realize they've been outplayed all along. The real art of deception isn't in the big moves, it's in the small details. As the detective returned to the interrogation room with a fresh cup of coffee and a slightly more determined expression, the suspect began his most careful performance yet. He'd spent the last few minutes alone practicing subtle changes in his breathing pattern, preparing for what would come next. "Let's go over your story one more time," the detective said, settling back into her chair. Her tone had shifted slightly, more direct now, with an edge of skepticism that told him she was starting to feel the pressure from her superiors watching behind the mirror. The jewelry store robbery had made headlines, and they needed results. He started fidgeting with his fingers, not too obviously, just enough to suggest growing anxiety. When he spoke, he let his voice crack slightly on certain words, as if the stress was starting to get to him. "Like I said before, I was just walking home." He paused, swallowed hard, then continued with a slightly shaky voice. Every gesture was calculated to appear natural and unplanned. The detective leaned forward, her elbows resting on the metal table. The overhead light cast shadows under her eyes, revealing the fatigue of a long shift. She'd been working for at least 12 hours, he could tell by the slight wrinkles in her blazer and the way she occasionally rolled her shoulders to ease the tension. As she flipped through her notes, he noticed how her questions were becoming more circular, returning to previous points, looking for inconsistencies. This was textbook interrogation technique, the same approach he'd studied in countless police procedural manuals. The key was to stay one step ahead, to anticipate the pattern and prepare responses that seemed spontaneous but were actually carefully crafted. "Your warehouse job," she said, tapping her pen against the paper. "Which company do you work for?" The question was casual, but he knew better. They'd already run his background. This was a trap, testing to see if he'd stick to his story or try to change it. He gave the name of a real warehouse company, one he knew had recently laid off a large number of workers. It would take them time to verify his employment status, and by then it wouldn't matter. Each answer he gave was like laying down a playing card in a complex game of solitaire. Everything had to align perfectly. The detective's phone buzzed again. This time, she picked it up, frowning slightly at the message. Perfect. The evidence team was probably coming up empty at the crime scene. He could use this growing frustration to his advantage. When she looked back at him, he made sure to avoid eye contact for exactly 2 seconds before meeting her gaze, a subtle sign of submission that would make him appear less threatening. Hours ticked by, marked by the steady clicking of the wall clock and the periodic hum of the ventilation system. He kept track of every detail, how often the detective checked her watch every 20 minutes, how many times someone walked past the door, 14 so far, even the gradual decrease in coffee levels in her cup. The questioning continued, but now he began introducing tiny inconsistencies in his story, nothing major, just small details that seemed to result from stress and fatigue. The time he left work changed by 5 minutes. The color of the bus he took became slightly different. These weren't mistakes, they were breadcrumbs, leading the investigation exactly where he wanted it to go. He could sense the observers behind the mirror growing restless. The occasional shuffle of feet, the soft murmur of whispered conversations. They were getting nowhere, and everyone knew it. But that was exactly the point. Every minute they spent focusing on his seemingly nervous behavior was a minute they weren't spending on what he was really doing. The detective pushed back her chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor. "I need to make a few calls," she said, gathering her files. He noticed the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the papers just a bit too tightly. She was frustrated, maybe even starting to doubt their initial assumptions about his involvement. As the door closed behind her, he allowed himself to slump forward slightly, as if exhausted. Anyone watching would see exactly what they expected, a suspect wearing down under intensive questioning. They'd never suspect that every yawn, every nervous gesture, every stumbled word had been part of an elaborate performance. The next phase would begin soon. The detective would return, probably with a new strategy. Maybe they'd try good cop/bad cop, or perhaps they'd claim to have evidence they didn't really possess. It didn't matter. He was prepared for every scenario. After all, the best way to predict your opponent's moves is to guide them there yourself. As the detective closed her file and stood up, announcing she'd be back in a few minutes, he allowed himself a moment of silent satisfaction. Phase 1 was proceeding exactly as planned. Soon, they would move to the next act of this elaborate performance, and he would show them just how much they had underestimated him. After all, the best magic tricks are the ones where the audience thinks they know exactly what they're watching, right until the moment everything changes. The detective who walked into interview room 3 had seen thousands of suspects over her 15 years on the force. She carried herself with the confidence that came from experience, case file tucked under one arm as she pulled out the uncomfortable metal chair across from her newest suspect. To her, this was just another day at work. To him, it was all part of a carefully crafted plan. She placed her coffee cup on the table, ceramic, department issue, half full. The steam rising from it suggested it was fresh, probably from the break room he passed earlier. She'd likely be wanting refills during this conversation, and every time she left the room would be another opportunity to observe and adapt his strategy. The room felt smaller than it actually was, a deliberate design choice he'd read about in a psychology journal at the library. The off-white walls showed signs of age, small cracks near the corners, a few scuff marks at eye level. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, creating a subtle but persistent background noise that most people wouldn't consciously notice but would slowly wear on their nerves. "Let's talk about where you were at 8:45 this evening," the detective said, her tone professional but not unkind. She opened her case file, revealing photographs of the jewelry store's broken window and several pages of preliminary reports. Her wedding ring caught the harsh overhead light as she arranged the papers, married, but the slight tan line suggested she often removed it. Probably takes it off during fieldwork, a detail that spoke to her experience and practicality. He shifted slightly in his chair, letting his shoulders slump forward just enough to project uncertainty. "I was walking home from the bus stop," he replied, his voice carefully modulated to sound nervous but not frightened. "I work nights at the warehouse district." A reasonable alibi, impossible to verify quickly given the late hour. Another calculated move in this high-stakes chess game. The detective made a note in her file, her pen making soft scratching sounds against the paper. He noticed she was left-handed, her grip on the pen slightly awkward due to the standard right-handed design of the department issue handcuffs that secured him to the table. These small details others might miss were like pieces of gold to him. Through the two-way mirror, he could sense others watching. The slight shuffle of feet, the occasional cough. He estimated 2, maybe 3 observers. Standard procedure for a case involving a high-value theft. They'd be taking notes, watching his body language, looking for signs of deception. He gave them exactly what they expected to see. The questioning continued, each exchange carefully choreographed from his side. When she asked about his previous record, he hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before answering, long enough to seem reluctant, but not so long as to appear calculating. When she showed him surveillance photos from nearby streets, he leaned forward with just the right mix of confusion and concern. He noticed how she placed her phone on the table, screen down but positioned where she could see incoming notifications. The screen lit up twice during their conversation, likely updates from the evidence team still processing the crime scene. Each time, her eyes flickered to the phone for just a fraction of a second. He filed away this pattern, knowing it might become useful later. The ventilation system hummed overhead, pushing cool air into the room at regular intervals. He counted the seconds between cycles, 32 exactly. The sound provided perfect cover for subtle movements, like testing the give in his handcuffs or shifting his weight to maintain circulation. Every system had its rhythms, and he was learning this one's dance. Time ticked by on a wall clock, an analog model, slightly off-level, its second hand moving with a soft but distinct click. The detective maintained her professional demeanor, but small tells betrayed her growing frustration. The way she repositioned her coffee cup, now empty, how she occasionally glanced at her notes before asking questions she already knew the answers to. The slight tapping of her foot under the table when his responses seemed to lead nowhere. This was more than just an interrogation to him. It was a performance, a carefully orchestrated dance where every movement, every word, every gesture had been planned and considered. He'd spent years preparing for moments like this, studying not just police procedures but human nature itself. The way people react under pressure, the subtle signs of growing impatience, the predictable patterns of behavior that emerge during long questioning sessions. The cold metal of the police cruiser's backseat pressed against his back as they drove through the quiet streets of downtown. The young man sat there, his dark eyes taking in every detail of his surroundings while maintaining a perfectly calm exterior. Outside, the city lights flickered against the evening sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalks where just hours ago a daring jewelry store heist had taken place. The cops had picked him up 3 blocks from the crime scene. Sure, he matched the general description: tall, athletic build, wearing dark clothes, but that could describe half the guys in the neighborhood. What they didn't know was that every second in this car was giving him exactly what he needed: information. He noticed how the senior officer kept adjusting his body camera, a clear sign it was new equipment they weren't fully comfortable with yet. The younger officer driving the car had a habit of checking his mirrors every 40 seconds, he'd been counting. These weren't just random observations, they were pieces of a puzzle he was already putting together. The police station came into view, a 3-story brick building with cameras positioned at what seemed like every angle. But he spotted the blind spots immediately. There's always a blind spot if you know where to look. As they pulled into the parking lot, he made mental notes of everything. The security keypad by the side entrance, the shift change timing shown by officers heading to their cars, even the way the front desk was positioned in relation to the main exit. The officers led him inside, their grip firm but not aggressive. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they walked through the corridors. He kept his head slightly down, appearing submissive, but his eyes were constantly moving. 8 security cameras in the main hallway. 2 emergency exits. 1 elevator, probably requiring key card access. 3 separate corridors leading to different sections of the building. "Watch your step," the younger officer said mechanically as they approached a short flight of stairs. The suspect complied, noting how the officer's keys jingled with each step: standard issue handcuff key on the right, building access card in the middle, personal keys on the left. Every detail, no matter how small, could be useful. They passed the break room where 2 detectives were pouring coffee, chatting about their weekend plans. Through the partially open door, he caught a glimpse of the duty roster posted on the wall. Night shift would start in 4 hours. Another piece of the puzzle. The interrogation room they led him to was small, probably designed to feel claustrophobic. One table bolted to the floor. He could tell by the slight discoloration around the base. Two chairs, one significantly more comfortable than the other. A two-way mirror on the left wall. A camera in the corner with a blinking red light and a vent system that hummed just loudly enough to be noticeable. As they secured him to the table with a longer chain than standard procedure usually allowed, interesting mistake number one, he kept his face neutral. The officers probably saw what they expected to see. Another routine suspect, possibly nervous, definitely caught up in something he shouldn't have been. They had no idea that their routine suspect had spent the last 3 years studying police procedures, architecture, and human psychology through every book he could get his hands on. The door closed with a click that echoed in the small room. He was alone now, but he knew it wouldn't last long. They'd make him wait. Standard procedure to build anticipation and anxiety. That was fine. He needed time to think anyway. The real performance was about to begin, and he had to get every detail right. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he heard footsteps approaching. The steady click of shoes against linoleum told him his interviewer was coming. The pace of the footsteps, the slight pause before the door handle turned, everything told the story. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about proving a point. Sometimes the best way to beat the system was to understand it better than the people who built it. Through the door came a detective, case file in hand, wearing an expression that had probably intimidated countless suspects before. Well, this was going to be an interesting evening for everyone involved.